Okay, welcome to week 3 of the Normans. Today we're going to have lectures 5 and 6, and I apologize, I did get them done and saved as web documents, and I forgot to put them on the website for all of you here in the class tonight, but I'll be getting them on later. I'm going to try sitting down this week, because apparently the overhead projector, the Elmo, interferes with the microphones, which is why my voice cuts out from time to time for those at the on the remote sites. I see that we have some people at the remote sites. Can you hear me, Fort Bend?
We can hear you fine. They might turn the gain up on your mic a little bit, make it a little bit more loud, but we can hear you fine. And we've got one of your central people here tonight.
Oh, good. So that all of you there can both hear and see me. That's good. Now we see someone else. There's someone else there. Someone with a blue shirt on. Yes, there you are. You're waving, but can you talk to me? I can't hear you.
Yes, I can.
You can. Where are you?
I'm in the Woodlands.
Woodlands, good, terrific. Okay, we have 2 of our remote sites connected. Oh, Don, I can't see the. No, there's nothing on this little one. I turned the power on. It's not on it. Okay, I'm going to, while he's fooling with that, I'm going to try sitting down tonight because, as I said, it interferes with the microphone. The overhead projector interferes with the microphone in some way, so we're going to try this sitting down. Oh, since I didn't turn it on, okay.
That's lamp.
Okay.
No, you're doing fine there.
All right, I'm fine there. Not coming through.
We even have it turned on. Interesting.
All right. Oh, it's flickering now. It's flickering. The Vikings never had this problem, nor did the Normans. All their technology worked.
Well, this is odd because we're 2 there.
All right. Well, while he's trying to fix that, I'll go ahead and mention some of you are having problems getting the books. I believe the publisher is on the syllabus that I gave you, and so I would suggest you email the publisher, put in a search on Google or someplace, and find the publisher's website, order it directly from them if you're having problems getting the book, especially this late. Okay, and if you don't have some of the books, read the others. Well, I can't show you that. Is it showing on the screen, Don? All right, because I can look at the screen.
Anything?
Nope.
As far as we can be. Nobody has cap. No any good Norman jokes?
No, I don't. Everything I have to do tonight, I have to show you, which is what is unfortunate here.
Because the camera appears to be dead, because we're not getting it. If I can't get it directly to this.
Mm-hmm.
We were fooling with something over here, and the image showed up for like a second.
Oh, there it is. There it is. Oh, we got a success. Thank you, Don. Okay, now let me try to center this. Okay, the first thing I wanted to do is show you some museum reproductions of Viking artifacts, and I think we need to kind of focus these a little better. Is that a little better? Okay, this is from 400 AD. It is a, can you see the snake heads on it? It's an armband. Can you see those? Maybe if I zoom down on it, you can see those better. All right, now let's try to focus. Yes, yes. Okay, there. And can you see those serpent heads on this armband? And this dates from 400 AD. Now this is a brooch, and it's quite magnificent. It was found in England, in the north of England, but it's actually the style, the artistic style that was done in churches, wooden churches in Norway. And so the many conquests I'm going to tell you about of England by the Vikings, I'm sure this is one of the things that was left there, and so they found it. And I wanted to show you a couple of other things here. Here are some chess pieces, and I'm going to zoom out then on these. These are replicas of chess pieces that were found in the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, and they're quite beautiful reproductions of the king and the queen. I have some other pictures of chess pieces. I'll let you see the back too with these carvings that are on it. So they're really quite magnificent. They would have been made out of walrus ivory originally. These are resin castings. So that's what I wanted to show you to start with. And I also have some books that I want to show you. Last time I mentioned to you some of the sources for the Normans, and let me just mention the most important source for the Normans is Dudo of Saint-Quentin, History of the Normans. This is a translation of it by Eric Christensen, a translation with an introduction and notes, and so this is available for you. Another thing I need to put on the website is a bibliography of all the sources that are translated into English. It's very long. This is another thing I mentioned. Dudo is very legendary. This book is my book, and it's the translations of the Life of Erlois. I believe that the Life of Erlois is the most, this is the Boydell Press, the Life of Erlois is the most trustworthy source in pre-conquest England. And let me see if I can just, well, maybe I won't show it to you, but this is the book that it's in. It's translated here. And as far as I know, this is the only place it's translated. Nobody else has done it. Okay. I'll mention these other books as we go along today then. So let's look at the Viking infusions into England. Before the Viking conquest, the first Viking conquest, a heptarchy ruled England. That means that there were about 5 different kings of England, and England was divided into different kingdoms. And there had been a trend toward unification in England because there was someone called an over-king, a king who would be, I've forgotten what he's called, but he is a grand king that all the other kings paid allegiance to, and so that tendency went on from time to time. So there was a trend toward unification in most of the history of England. The smaller kingdoms of earlier years were gradually absorbed into the larger ones. In the late 7th century, the Northumbrians, the Mercians, and the West Saxons were the major kingdoms, and the Northumbria was the leading kingdom in the 7th century, but then by the 8th century, Mercia emerged as the leading kingdom. Ethelbald and Offa had unparalleled political power for that time. And I wanted to show you the Kingdom of England, the beautiful Kingdom of England, the land, and what it looks like. It's very green and damp. But that means it has a lot of moisture. It's like Houston. It's very humid and very damp, and there's a lot of rain, and so it's a very green country, and it's also cold, but not as cold as Norway in the north, but maybe it's a lot like Denmark. I think it's a little bit hillier than Denmark, but it's a lot like Denmark in its climate. So here is a scene of the English countryside, and here's another scene of the beautiful landscape that they found in England. So no wonder the Vikings thought they had found a really wonderful land to go to, and they were interested in conquering it. Here is a map of England in 626 before the Vikings started conquering it, and you can see all of these different kingdoms. The South Saxons are here, the Kingdom of Kent is here, the East Angles are here, the East Saxons are here, the West Saxons are here. These are the Mercians. This is Mercia right here, and this is Northumberland, and that is divided into Berenicia and Strathclyde and Cambria and Deira. And it wasn't clear at the time, before the Vikings invaded, Northumberland could belong as easily to Scotland as to England. And the modern boundary between Scotland and England is right here, so that you see that Northumberland is kind of halfway into Scotland and halfway into England. So that at that time, it wasn't clear that it was going to be part of England, and it wasn't clear until long after the Norman conquest which country that Northumberland would belong to and where Scotland and England were divided. And we'll come across that again later. This is a Celtic Christian artifact. This actually comes from Brittany. I couldn't find an Anglo Saxon one, but this comes from Brittany, and it's typical of what the Celts were doing, the kind of artwork they were doing. It's quite simplistic, but they also did a lot of interlace and metal work. Here is a church that is typical of the churches in England, the Anglo-Saxon churches, especially this one, but also this one. And it's very simple architecture, and the churches are very small, and this is typically Anglo-Saxon. Here is a cross that is typical of what the Anglo-Saxons would do. And these kinds of buildings and crosses especially were all over Anglo-Saxon England, so it would have been what the Vikings found when they got there. A Celtic cross at Iona. There was a resurgence of commercial activities, and Charlemagne wrote to Offa, this is in the 7th century, or the 8th century, "You wrote us about merchants. We extend to them our personal protection, as is the ancient custom for those engaged in trade. If treated wrongfully, let them appeal to us or our judges, and we will see that they have full justice. Similarly, should any of our subjects suffer injustice in your kingdom, they shall appeal to you for a just remedy, so that no trouble may occur between our subjects." And so trade was encouraged between the Carolingian kingdom on the continent and the kingdoms in England at the time. And so note the significance of the formal arrangement, where both of them are writing to each other, and they're establishing the way that merchants are to be treated in each of their countries. Alcuin wrote to King Offa from the continent, praising him for being intent on education, that the light of wisdom, which is now extinguished in many places, may shine in your kingdom. And Alcuin himself was an Englishman. He was from York, and he had been sent for by Charlemagne to come to the continent and really start the Renaissance that was going on in Charlemagne's kingdom. So Alcuin himself was an Englishman, and he was writing back to Offa, King Offa, to encourage him to keep up the trend of education in England. Offa's dyke was built against the Welsh border, and it was built at about the time that the Vikings were moving in there. Was it against the Welsh or against Viking attacks? Because the Viking attacks started in the 750s. In Northampton in the late 8th century, the first stone hall was built in Britain since Roman times, and it was 123 feet long, 25 feet longer than the timber hall at Yevering. And the Mercian ascendancy corresponded to the Carolingian ascendancy on the continent. In the 9th century, in Wessex, Alfred's court was celebrated, and this was the beginning of the famous Anglo Saxon Chronicle, which is a treasure of information about the Viking invasions of England and also the Norman invasions of England. This is the newest edition that is still in print, if any of you are interested in it. It's the Anglo Saxon Chronicle in all 5 versions, and it's translated and edited by Michael Swanton. And let me just move that up a little bit so you can see his name. The publisher is Routledge. Maybe I can turn to the title page so that you can see Routledge is the publisher. And if any of you are interested in getting that, you can follow the Norman conquest in it. And we'll be looking at that again when we look at the English version of the Norman conquest. Okay. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but it corresponds to the Viking Age, and all of the different Viking invasions of England are told about in the Chronicle. In 865, the Danish host, or the Great Army, conquered all of England outside Wessex, and huge numbers of Danish settlers followed, and they followed in relatively unpopulated land in an area called the Danelaw. And here we have Charlemagne's Empire. We can see the Carolingian Empire, which was a very vast empire, and the invasion of England in 865 was at the time when the Carolingian Empire was actually breaking up. It was from Denmark and Norway in this direction. We'll have a map of England in a minute. Yorkshire was in southern Northumbria, East Anglia and the 5 boroughs, and Lincoln, Stamford, and the 5 boroughs were Lincoln, Stamford, Nottingham, Leicester, and Derby. By 871, most of the English kingdoms had collapsed, including Wessex. Alfred the Great lived from 878 to 899, and he was the one who initiated the reconquest of England. First of all, he was driven to the island of Athelney by the Vikings. And I'll show you that on the map in a moment. He was driven there, and the Vikings essentially conquered all of England except for Wales. And Wales isn't part of England anyway. Alfred the Great is called the Great because he stopped the Viking invasions, he turned it around, and he initiated a series of policies that enabled the English to not drive the Vikings out. They never drove them out, but what they did was reestablish the kingdoms and then incorporate the Vikings into their kingdoms. So immediately from the time of Alfred the Great, England was very Scandinavianized. It became very Scandinavian. Yeah, comment.
Did Danes stay in Northumbria mostly, or?
Yes, in that Northumbria area. I'll show you in a minute where the Danelaw is. I do have a map that shows the Danelaw. It's mostly around the area of Northumberland, and it spreads pretty far south, amazingly south, as we'll see. Alfred himself was a king of many talents. He was a warrior, an administrator, a diplomat, a scholar, and a leader. And his reign witnessed the evolution of the West Saxon monarchy into the English monarchy. He himself was the first to call himself Rex Anglorum, which means King of England. Yes, question. Oops, your mic is gone. It's his reign. It's his reign. Mostly the dates I'm giving you are regnal dates. The date of 878 to 899 is his regnal date. That was the question. Here is an example of Viking art that was done in the north of England. Notice that this is a Christian Viking who's done this art. He's made a cross with a Viking. It's very like the old Celtic crosses that we saw, but with a Viking interpretation of it. Here is a portrait of Alfred the Great. Obviously, this is a modern portrait, and we don't really know what he looked like. But we do have his scepter. I'll show you his scepter in a moment. Here is England with the map I promised you of the Danelaw. Sorry. And this is Alfred's kingdom as he recaptured the kingdom down here. And this is the Danelaw, and you can see that the Danes are controlling almost as much of England as Alfred controlled. And in fact, Alfred is called the first king of all England, but he really wasn't, because he only controlled really Wessex and Essex, and this was East Wales, and Mercia. This is the kingdom of Mercia here. And the Danelaw is all this area here. This is where the Danes settled, and eventually a treaty was signed by Alfred with the Danes that allowed the Danes to live under their own law in the territory that they settled, and that's why it's called the Danelaw. Yeah.
Combined, unified the Anglo Saxons, it looked like.
No, he didn't. I mean, the concept of a unified kingdom starts with Alfred, but it didn't happen until his grandson Ethelstan's reign, in fact. And we'll trace that a little bit. Here's Alfred's Jewel, which has a portrait of him, and this is on his scepter. But notice how Viking it looks. Doesn't that seem very Viking to you, Alfred's Jewel? In 872, in fact, Alfred purchased a treaty from the Danes, and he bought time to renovate the military. One of the first things he did was to restructure all of the institutions of England, especially the army. The Fyrd is what the army was called, and there's the Great Fyrd and the Lesser Fyrd, but he divided it into two halves, and each half would serve for 6 months per year. And the Fyrd itself was a national conscript army of all able-bodied men. So all the men in England had to serve in the Fyrd, and only half of it was called up at one time. And they served limited times, only 6 months per year, so that the harvest could be gotten in as well. The second thing he did was to begin building a fleet of ships, and so he built a fleet of 60 oared ships, neither after the Frisian design nor after the Danish design, so that what he did, the Frisians had their own ships that were different from the Viking ships, and so what he did was adapt the ship design in a very creative new way to design ships especially for England. And these were faster, higher, and much longer than the Danish ships, so we have a creative intellect in the design. Did you have a question?
I kind of have two questions. The first of which is there a motivation for consolidation, or is this kind of a blanket move for power? And secondly, since it's a conscript army, how did he convince people to fight? I mean, if it's a conscript army, you have a unified army that's well trained. Mm-hmm. How did he control them without them overthrowing him, given the first part of the question, which is what is the motivation?
Okay. The motivation is to defend the kingdom, because the Vikings are attacking and capturing people and enslaving them. And so the motivation is to fight back and keep the Vikings out, because the English were very aware that they were different than the Vikings, even though the interesting thing is their languages were so similar that they could understand each other with a little effort. But they could understand each other and talk to each other. But they knew the Vikings were invaders, and they knew they were taking over their land. And so they wanted to fight back, and they were willing to fight back. And there are also old traditions that go all the way back to the Germanic time of people swearing an oath to their lord, men swearing an oath to their lord. And we see the same Germanic institutions in Carolingian Europe under Charlemagne, where in Charlemagne's kingdom, all men had to swear an oath of allegiance to Charlemagne. And so he may have taken it actually from Charlemagne, this oath of allegiance. which goes all the way back in Germanic times to the earliest times, but now it's being tied to a head of a large state, and this is something new that hadn't happened before. So it's an innovation. Also, having a fleet of ships in England is an innovation. The Angles and the Saxons came on ships to England, but they seem to have stopped building ships, although there were merchants. And we already saw the evidence of merchants going back and forth between England and France. So there were merchant ships. And so it was just one step to build a military fleet for England, really for the first time. And this had to go along with an idea of a unified state of some kind, because the kingdoms before were too small to have any kind of a defensive system of this type, or to need it. And so it's something that goes along with the idea of a unified state. The third thing that he did, so the Fyrds are the first thing, the fleet is the second thing, and the third thing is the burghs. Apparently, there weren't very many cities in England at this time. London had been there since Roman times, and York had been there. But now, he set up a system of large walled and fortified settlements, and they weren't cities to begin with. They were just places that were walled. They were fortifications. They weren't castles. Definitely not castles. They were walled cities, where people from the countryside could flee and go into the city, and in case the Danes came and invaded them, they could defend themselves in the city and protect themselves. And so the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says, cities and towns he restored, and others he constructed where none had been before. 30 large burghs were built so that virtually nobody in Wessex was more than a day's walk from a burgh. And so everything he did it in Wessex first. That was his kingdom. And then later, he applied these same standards to the rest of his kingdom. So he experimented in Wessex. And the burghs were defensive points. And they really transformed England, because they grew into cities, and then they became central trading posts, areas of trade. They were mostly built on the Roman roads that were left over from the Roman Empire. And so in addition to defending themselves from the Vikings, he also stimulated a great explosion in trade and an expansion in the trading network. Here's a picture of some Saxons, and unfortunately this is the only picture of Saxons I have, so you're going to see it several times tonight. But here are some Saxons, and here it's called a Saxon castle, but it really is more of it's a burgh, it's a fortified city. The Saxons did not have castles. In fact, this is misnamed. Here is a ship that existed at the time of Ethelred the Unready, so this would have been in the 11th century. This is what a Saxon ship would have looked like. It looks kind of like a Viking ship, but a little bit different. It has this strange thing on the end of it, and of course it's a drawing, so we don't know what it really looked like. But it doesn't look exactly like a Viking ship, I don't think. It definitely is English. The burghal Heitage assigned responsibility for maintenance and defense to the locals. And so that the land of England was divided into hides, and a hide is a very strange measurement of land. A hide is a plowland, okay? And the hides are divided up by how much they yield, so that they are not a consistent size. It's productive hides, in other words, would be smaller than less productive hides on less productive land. It's really confusing to figure out how much land was in England. But England was divided into hides, and people who owned these hides then had to take a certain amount of responsibility according to how much land they held for maintaining and defending the burgage system. And so the kingdom-wide Burgle defense system had as many as 27,000 men. Well, in 876, the Danish Viking Guthrum attacked Wessex, and in 878, he and Alfred fought the Battle of Edington. Guthrum attacked again in the dead of winter, and Alfred fled to Athelney. There he held out with a small group of men throughout the winter, and Guthrum and Alfred met in a pitched battle at Edington, and Alfred won a decisive victory. Guthrum at that point was baptized and agreed to abandon Wessex forever. Did he take a Christian oath, or did he just swear the oath through Viking trickery, because the Vikings would swear any oath, you know, an oath meant nothing to them. But Guthrum did keep his oath, and so he was one of the first Viking Christians. And here is a picture. This is another chess piece of what a Viking warrior might have looked like, a Viking self-portrait, if you will. Comment.
I find this interesting that you say that the Vikings will just, swear any old oath. Because, I mean, if you read their stories, occasionally, yes, maybe an oath made under duress.
Oh, you're not pressing your mic.
Start over again.
Terribly sorry.
Okay.
I was commenting on the Viking oaths. They considered their honor and in keeping their word very important from every saga and tale I've ever read.
To other Vikings, not necessarily to the enemy.
Okay, I see the difference now.
Yes, because of course he swore a Christian oath to Alfred. Okay, here is another Viking. This is a mounted Viking, and it's a chess piece again. Maybe we'll zoom out. No, we're out as far as we can go. Okay. All right, it's a mounted Viking. All right. In 886, Alfred occupied and recaptured London, and he signed a new treaty with Guthrum, and this defined the boundary between Alfred and the Danes, and it was a long Watling Street from London to Chester, northwestward, and Alfred set up Ethelred as a sub-king or ealdorman of Mercia, and married his daughter Ethelfleda, Lady of the Mercians, to Ethelred. So this is Alfred's daughter Ethelfleda, who was called Lady of the Mercians, and she was married to Ethelred, and Ethelred was a sub-king under Alfred, and his daughter would enforce the alliance with him through a marriage alliance. By 899, Alfred had made southwest England secure and had seized London and fortified and organized the kingdom. Alfred then built a timber royal hall at Cheddar and collected and edited the royal law codes and issued new dooms of his own. Okay, all the law codes of England before the Norman conquest date to the time of Alfred. Some of them were actually written before Alfred, but he is the one who collected them all and rewrote them, and so our copies were written at the time of Alfred's reign, and then he issued his own law code in addition to those. Here is that line along Watling Street to Chester, and this is the border between Alfred and the Vikings. This is London right here, and this is Athelney down here, where Alfred fled when the Vikings drove him out of his kingdom. So this is Alfred's kingdom here, and here is the original border, but then he got control up here as well. This is Watling Street, all right. Here is the introduction to his law code. Then I, Alfred, collected these laws together and ordered that many of them which our forefathers observed should be written down, mainly those I liked, and with the advice of my witan, I rejected many of those that I didn't like and ordered that they be observed differently. I have not presumed to set in writing much of my own, because it was unknown to me what might please those who shall come after us. So I have collected here the dooms which seem to me the most just, whether from the time of Ina, my kinsman, or of Offa, king of the Mercians, or of Ethelbert, the first of the English to receive baptism. I have thrown out the rest. Okay, one wonders what those laws were that he threw out. Then I, Alfred, king of the West Saxons, showed these to all my witan, who declared that they were all pleased to observe them. All right, you notice that there's something he's mentioning called a witan. And this is called variously, the witan, or a longer name for it is witangimo. And what it is a council of his chief barons, or his chief men, the chief warriors at his court, and he is obliged to consult with them before he can do anything. Yes, did you have a comment?
Can you just print that longer word a bit more clearly? It's very hard to read what you wrote.
Okay. Okay, witangimo.
Thank you.
All right, and that's a longer word. Usually it's called witan, but it's a council of barons, and we'll run across it again. It's a very important institution in England that will have a role in the Norman conquest. Okay, now Alfred divided Wessex into shires or counties as administrative districts, and each shire was governed by an ealdorman who led troops to the army and led the defense of the shire. Both a royal official and a local aristocrat led the fyrd and governed the shire in the king's name, and also provided over the shire court, which was convened once a year. And this consisted of important local freeholders who supplied evidence and declared ancient customs and gave a solemn oath, or the ordeal was which determined guilt or innocence. It was both a royal and a regional institution. And the reason I'm trying to tell you about the government of England now in Anglo-Saxon times, as Alfred established it, is because when William the Conqueror conquered England, he kept some of these things and he changed others. And so we want to see what he had to work with when he actually conquered the Kingdom of England. Okay. The shires themselves were each divided into hundreds, and these centered on a hundred court. And so we're getting into smaller and smaller units. The 100 court met once a month and was presided over by a reeve. Each shire was composed of 100 hides, and remember we said that the hides were very irregular land units because they were attuned to the productivity of the land and not to the size of the land. Okay, originally one hide supported one warrior. So that's how it was when Alfred set it up. It changed over time, but that's what it was originally. Alfred was also a patron of learning like Charlemagne. Remember that Alcuin went to Charlemagne's court and set up all the schools for Charlemagne to carry out the Carolingian Renaissance. And here's a quotation from, I think it's from the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. So completely had learning decayed in England that there were very few men this side of the Humber who could apprehend their Latin services in English or even translate a letter from Latin to English. And I think that there were not many beyond the Humber. There were so few of them that I cannot even recollect a single one south of the Thames when I succeeded to the kingdom. This is actually Alfred I'm quoting here. These are his own words when he justified the revival of learning. And when he revived learning in England, he did something very interesting. He did it in the vernacular, and he started translating Latin, the Latin of the church, to Anglo-Saxon, and all the publications at his court were in Anglo-Saxon. So here are the areas of England, the kingdoms of England, Wessex and Mercia, Sussex, Essex, Kent and East Anglia. And here are the shires that when Alfred had control of everything, of course the shires that he first developed were only in this area that he held, and then later on these other shires are added, and we'll see when the other shires are added. But this is essentially the map that William the Conqueror would inherit when he conquered England. These are the shires that he encountered that Alfred had set up. Alfred then brought to his court learned men from far and himself wrote a life of King Alfred. He brought Frankish scholars from Reims in northern France. He brought Werewolf and others from the kingdom of Mercia, and so we have a kind of Anglo Saxon Renaissance at this time that's almost comparable to what Charlemagne did. Alfred tried to create a literate priesthood, and there was a notable school at his court and a few monastic schools, but at this time the monasteries were not very well developed. There weren't very many, and only a very few where there could be any sort of literate life. But most importantly, Alfred determined that the lay aristocrats should be educated, and that they should be administrators and military commanders, and the administrators and military commanders should be able to read and write and be literate. Alfred and the court scholars that he gathered there at his court translated Latin works into Anglo Saxon, and here's a list of them. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, and of course that's a history of England that was written about the original conversion of England from paganism to Christianity. Pope Gregory I's pastoral care was sent to every bishopric in England. And Pope Gregory I is very important in England. I'm laying some more background for you here. When the Normans come in, they're going to use a lot of these things as they reform the church. But Pope Gregory I is regarded as the apostle to the English because he is the one who sent the missionaries to England who originally converted the King of Kent, Ethelbert, and the Kingdom of Kent, which is the first Christian kingdom of England. And what he did was to tie England very firmly to Rome, whereas the Frankish church under Charlemagne was quite independent from Rome. Under Pope Gregory I and the sending of these missionaries, England became tied to Rome at a very early time. Yeah.
Was this around the beginning of the 7th century?
Yes, it was. So it was before Charlemagne. But the church in France was independent before he sent the missionaries, and also after he sent the missionaries. It was independent from Rome. Yeah.
And it looks like there were some English missionaries active on the continent also.
There were, and Alcuin could be considered one of those missionaries who went to the continent. That's kind of another story, but they went because...
One that went to Denmark?
Oh, lots of them went to Denmark, yeah. They went to Frisia, and they went to Denmark, and they went to the Saxons, Saxony. They went to all those areas. Lots and lots of them went. And one of them was, let's see, which one was it? Boniface. Boniface was the one who actually persuaded the Carolingian kings, Pepin, the father of Charlemagne, to throw in his lot with the papacy, and so to tie himself to the papacy. But Charlemagne did it in a very grudging way. He didn't do it wholeheartedly like the English did originally. The English are going to have a problem with that when we get to the Norman period. The question of whether to obey Rome or not to obey Rome and how closely that tie should stretch. But this is the tradition it goes back to. Pope Gregory I and his pastoral care is a kind of rule book or guideline for how a bishop should rule his bishopric. And he sees the bishop as primarily a teacher, and that is his role, to be a teacher. So this, again, will come up when we look at the Normans and how they reformed the church. St. Augustine's Confessions is a very basic book in the library of every Christian, and so he's someone who is much admired. Orosius's World History is quite interesting as a choice for Alfred to interpret, because later, when we get into the Norman times, we're going to see that history becomes a topic of great interest to the Normans, and the writing of history kind of explodes after the Norman conquest. Yeah.
Is there any translation of the Old Testament or the New Testament in Alfred's efforts to translate into the vernacular?
Into Anglo Saxon? Not that I know of. I don't believe there was any translation of the Bible. Of the entire Bible, certainly not.
There may have been some books or selections.
I don't believe any survive. And I'm not sure about that, but it's never on any of the lists that I see. One of the really important things he did was to start the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which I mentioned to you before. It was begun in 892 by a West Saxon chronicler, and it went back before 892 as far back as they could remember. They recorded the history of England going back, and they used Bede as a guideline. Bede, of course, wrote his ecclesiastical history, and so this history is really important in England. I can't emphasize that enough. and then it becomes a year-by-year account. And the original version, which went back as far as they possibly could, was then sent to several ecclesiastical centers, and then it was continued from that point forward. And so today there survive 5 different versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and they're labeled A, B, C, D, and E. And so it was continued, or there survive chronicles from these 5 different monasteries in different parts of England. And so here you can read them placed side by side in this book on the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And they're placed side by side because the history of different portions of England will be different. And so you have to read all the different versions to find out what was going on in England. But that means you get to know what was happening everywhere. I mean, it really is a wonderful source for everything that's going on. Here is the preface to King Alfred's translation of Gregory's Pastoral Care. This is in Anglo-Saxon, or Old English it's called. And it's very close to Norse, and here's a translation beneath it. I'm not going to try to, it's not a translation, it's the words in Anglo-Saxon written in modern language. Yeah, transliteration, thanks. And here is a document, this is by Caedmon, a facsimile of the first page of Caedmon that is also in Anglo-Saxon. Okay. This is the illuminated letters that started it. Okay. Here is another illumination, and this is an historiated initial, and this shows an Anglo-Saxon king giving a written document to, it looks like a bishop here. Okay. And here are the kings of England, and I'm going to show you this genealogy from time to time as we go through it and we see the different kings of England. Yeah, question?
Are you going to be putting this genealogy on the web?
I'll try to remember to do it. Yeah, I can put it on the web. I just have to remember to do it. Okay, where have we got? Okay, here is Alfred right here. Alfred, we might mention that in the battles with the Danes, that all of Alfred's brothers were killed. There were 8 brothers, and he was the youngest one. And so he's the only surviving one, and these were all kings of England. This is his father, Ethelwulf, and his father was Egbert. Okay, Alfred then had 2 sons, Edward the Elder, and he had a son, Edward the Elder, and a daughter, Ethelfleda, who married Ethelred, ealdorman of the Mercians, and Ethelfleda was the lady of the Mercians. And then as we go through, we're going to look at the different sons of Edward the Elder, Athelstan, Edmund I, and Eadred, and their sons, and we'll go all the way down to where have we got? Okay, we'll go all the way down to Ethelred the Unready here. Ethelred the Unready, who married Emma of Normandy, and then her son was Edward the Confessor, who was king, on whose death William the Conqueror claimed the throne. So that basically shows the genealogy. All right. In the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, early entries were expanded by some of the chroniclers at the different locations, but it was continued by all of them, and 7 distinct manuscripts survive, and they represent 4 separate accounts. But that should be 5 separate accounts, actually. There are 5 versions. 3 end in the later 11th century between 1066 and 1079, and 1 continues to 1154. They're unique in the vernacular literature of the day, and there's nothing like it anywhere else in Europe, this vernacular literature. There was another Latin version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it's called... now it's called John of Worcester. In older versions, it's called Florence of Worcester. But scholars have determined that it was John who really wrote it, and Florence began it, but John was the real author of the Latin version. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was unique in the vernacular literature of its day, and the question is, was Alfred the architect of the English monarchy? Everybody always says, well, Alfred was the first king of all England, and he created the English monarchy. My opinion is that he created a blueprint for the English monarchy, and it was really his sons who built the monarchy and brought it all to fruition. And I personally think it's Athelstan who really is the first king of all England in reality, although Alfred had the concept of ruling all England. His sons had to bring it about. Edward the Elder was his son who inherited the throne, and he faced a rival to the throne, a first cousin allied with the Danes, and that first cousin was actually the son of his sister Ethelfleda, Lady of the Mercians. And so he was not really a rival to the throne, but he was claiming Mercia. And so immediately on the death of Alfred, there was the threat of the kingdom breaking up. But because of the concept of a unified England, Edward the Elder and his sister Ethelfleda worked together to bring together the kingdom and keep it unified. He and his sister Ethelfleda pursued an aggressive military policy against the Danelaw and strengthened the burghs and founded new ones in the Midlands. And the Midlands are essentially in Mercia. So the first burghs were actually in Wessex, and Ethelfleda, who's a very important English woman, was powerful in extending the rule to both kingdoms, Wessex and Mercia. In 911, all the Danish settlers south of the Humber River submitted to Edward, and Ethelfleda, Lady of the Mercians, married Ethelred Ealdorman of Mercia, who died in 911. The Danes of York offered to submit to her. But in 918, Ethelfleda died, and Mercia passed to Edward the Elder. So instead of her children inheriting, her brother inherited to keep the kingdom together. Edward was now king of the West Saxons and king of the Mercians, and Mercia and the Danelaw were then subdivided into shires, because remember, the Danelaw had submitted to Ethelfleda, so now he could divide it into shires, and some corresponded to the old kingdoms, Kent and Norfolk and Suffolk and Sussex and Essex. Some were patterned after the Burgle-Hydage district centered on the towns, and in these cases centered on the towns, they're named after the town: Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire, Cambridgeshire, Worcestershire. 4 of the 5 boroughs became the nuclei of the new shires. So now we have the shires extended into the Danelaw and also into the various areas of England. The ealdormen tended to gain power over a number of shires, and the shires tended to be led and governed by a shire reeve. So what was happening was the ealdormen established their power over a number of different shires when before they each ruled their individual shires. These ealdormen collected a bunch of shires, and now they have an administrative assistant under them in the shire called the shire reeve, which is in English pronunciation, the sheriff. Okay, so this is the beginning of the sheriff. He was a royal official. The hundreds were now being gathered into the control of local nobles and monasteries. And now there had been inflation, so it took 5 hides to support a warrior, and a warrior was called a thane. One reason there was inflation was because, you know, the burghs were stimulating trade, and trade was growing so much in England. But that also could be a Viking influence, because remember what great traders the Vikings were. So the settlement of the Vikings may well have stimulated trade within England. Yeah, question?
Probably also brought a lot of money from
yeah, they brought a lot of money, but most of the Vikings who settled in England, we don't know very much about them because they didn't have a Viking chronicle to tell us about them. And we do have the Orkneyinga saga, which tells all about the Vikings who were settling in Scotland and the Orkney Islands, and in Scotland. Yeah, there were Norwegians and Danes, but we have no sagas in England, and so we don't know what happened, what they were doing. But if they followed their ancestral patterns, they were raiding and trading, and especially trading, but they were also small farmers in the area. But the ideology of the old German comitatus was still very strong. The old Germanic ideas of military prowess and absolute loyalty to a lord and honor among warriors. And so the Vikings merged together with the Anglo Saxons because they shared these Germanic customs. And so they could get along together. Okay, here is the Humber River. And remember that the Danes in the Danelaw swore submission to Ethelfleda, and here is the city of York, which was a Danish city, a Danish kingdom before Alfred's time. Okay. And here are the shires again. Now we had our shires over on this side, now we have all of these shires over here added to the kingdom. Athelstan was the grandson of Alfred, and he ruled from 924 to 939. And it's under Athelstan that Alfred's dreams were really realized. He was a skilled military leader and a leader of yet another Renaissance. He really advanced the Renaissance that Alfred had begun. He turned back a major invasion of Yorkshire by Norse Vikings from Ireland, and he made himself a kind of emperor over these sub-kings who submitted to him. And so he really saw himself as a kind of Charlemagne, a Charlemagne figure, because in Charlemagne's empire, Charlemagne made each of his sons a sub-king under him, and he called himself an emperor. Well, Athelstan was modeling himself after Charlemagne. Yeah, do you have a
particular capital they had? Athelstan, was he located in Mercia or Wessex?
No, there was no capital of England at this time, and the kings traveled around, and this remained true well past the Norman period. that they didn't have a capital.
Is this a Germanic trait?
It's a medieval trait. I don't know. It must originate in Germanic times, but it's a medieval trait that the kings move around and their whole court travels with them.
But nothing like Aachen developed in England at that time.
Aachen was not a capital for Charlemagne either. London was the chief city in England, and the king's court would be held in London from time to time, but the court moved around in Anglo Saxon times and also in Norman times. Another question.
The reason they moved around was partly hygiene. They'd sit there at their great hall or whatever it was, or later on the castle for a while, and then all the waste and everything would build up, so they'd leave and then go to a next one along there and let the first one be cleaned out and aired out, and then they keep moving around like this. So it was partly because of that.
I haven't heard that theory. The theory I've heard is that, or read, is that they would travel to different places, and they would use the produce of the land. They would use all the food in the storeroom and for the animals and the people. I haven't heard of the hygiene theory, although it kind of makes sense. What is your evidence for that? What can you quote as evidence for that?
I've heard it in several historical programs, and I've also seen it in, I'd have to get the books out to look it up.
Because I've never run across that. It would have to be archaeological evidence unless there were written evidence in the sources. That would be interesting to see. Certainly it's tied to the amount of food that's in the storehouse, rather than the king having people bring all the taxes to him. He would travel around to the various estates and use everything up wherever he went. Okay. Athelstan turned back a major invasion of Yorkshire by Norse Vikings from Ireland, and they were trying to reconstitute the old kingdom of York, half of which was in York in England and the other half was in Ireland. It was linked together as a kingdom, and so the Vikings were trying to restore that kingdom, but Athelstan was able to hold them off. And he extended his sway across Northumbria, and so that would be to the north. Remember, that's that disputed land where we're not sure whether it's Scottish or English at this time. Well, this is when the English claim to it gets settled, gets set up, because Athelstan tried to extend his power as a kind of emperor over Northumbria. He also, like his grandfather, presided over a brilliant court and gathered scholars from near and far. He married his children to all the crowned heads of Europe and presided over the beginnings of an important ecclesiastical revival. So, although Alfred did not stimulate a revival of the church, Athelstan did. And he brought nearly all of England under his control politically, but not socially or culturally. And here we have our genealogy again, and let me point out where Alfred is. Alfred is here, Edward the Elder is here, and Athelstan is here. And I won't go into the details of actually his brothers died. They all had different mothers. I won't go into all these details, but they all had different mothers, and so it was there was a war between them as to who had the right claim. And Athelstan won, fortunately, because he was the smartest of the three. And so here's Edward the Elder, who is the son of Alfred, and here is Ethelfleda, Lady of the Mercians. Okay. The Northumbrians still remained a people apart. They thought of themselves as being separate from England. And the Danes in Yorkshire and East Anglia and the five boroughs were quite distinct. So the Danelaw remained distinctively different, and then they saw themselves as not part of the unified English. Edmund was the son of Athelstan, and he ruled from 939 to 946. He was the one who brought into being an oath like the one that Charlemagne had of all the men of the kingdom. All in the name of God shall swear fealty to King Edmund, as a man should be faithful to his lord, without dispute or treachery, in public and in private, loving what the king loves and shunning what the king shuns. So here is an oath of all the men of England to the King of England. Thus the powerful bond of allegiance between an ealdorman and his thanes and household and followers was subordinated to the still higher duty of all free subjects to swear loyalty to their king. And in reality, you can see England as being really the first unified kingdom that actually lasts in Europe. The universal allegiance to the king helped extend royal control over England. And here we see the unified kingdom of England, and here we have all of Northumbria, and Wales is separate, but all of England is now unified. And here are our Saxon warriors again. The ealdormen had to be royal officers, not local potentates, and they led the field in the king's name. The king was to lead the army in person, to be braver and fiercer than any of his warriors. Now, the son of Edmund was Edgar the Peaceable. His reign was marked by greatly improved conditions, and God granted that he lived his days in peace. He did his duty and labored zealously in performing it. He exalted God's praise far and wide and loved God's law. He improved the security of his people more than all the kings before him within human memory. So Edgar the Peaceable carried out the tradition of keeping the country unified. And so here we have our kings.
Quote from the Anglo Saxon Chronicle?
Yes, that's a quote from the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. So we have Edgar the Peaceable, who is here, and then he had two sons, Edward II and Ethelred II. So that's Edward the Martyr and Ethelred the Unready. Okay, so Ethelred the Unready is the one we're going to focus on. Okay. This is the coronation oath that Edmund swore. And this is very important because it defines the role of the king in England. In the name of the Holy Trinity, I promise three things to my Christian subjects. First, that God's church and all the Christian people of my realm shall enjoy true peace. Second, that I forbid robbery and wrongful deeds to all ranks of men. Third, that I exhort and command justice and mercy in all my judgments, so that the gracious and compassionate God who lives and reigns may grant us all his everlasting mercy. Edgar clearly in this oath, and this oath is very important because the Normans are then going to copy this when they become kings of England. Edgar blended the militarism of Germanic culture with Christian pacifism. Two ideals here coalesce. The king was both a peacekeeper and a Christian warrior and protector of the realm. And here is our historiated initial with the King of England handing down decisions or laws. Alfred's navy was now a well-organized fleet, and there were constant coastal patrols that protected them from the Viking, and either Edgar or Athelstan set that up. In 973, Edgar ordered the minting of reformed, standardized silver pennies to circulate kingdom-wide. And the kings of England may well have picked up this habit of minting coins from the Vikings because the Vikings had so many coins around all the time. But this is very important to the development of the English state. It was an indication also of the quickening commerce and the fact that trade and commerce was really growing and more prosperity. The growing towns now also paid taxes to the king in coinage, and the coins bore Edgar's name and portrait, and so we have royal propaganda. He managed the currency, and this increased the royal ability to increase taxes. So coining money led to the increased prosperity of the reign, and also intended to increase the ease of trade and commerce. Most towns ranged from 3,500 to 6,000 people, although York had 8,000 people. but only London was like a modern town. And here is an Anglo-Saxon ship as seen in the manuscript of Caedmon. Here we have another Anglo-Saxon ship that looks kind of Viking, but it is Anglo-Saxon. And here are the coins that were minted at this time. These are the oldest ones, and they have propaganda written on them. We'll come to these coins later. This is Ethelred's coinage here, and we'll be able to look at those. But they begin under Edgar, and here is a walled town. So now the burghs have developed into really defined towns. The monastic revival was led by St. Dunstan, Abbot of Glastonbury. Perhaps it was inspired by Cluny, who we remember Cluny had sent people to Normandy, and so we saw William of Dijon reforming the Norman church. In 960, Dunstan became Archbishop of Canterbury. He also had connections with Fleury, a Cluniac house on the Loire in France. He banned monastic drunkenness, licentiousness, and individual wealth, and banned control of the monastery by local aristocrats. He also worked closely with the monarchy, strictly enforcing the Benedictine rule, and some other monk reformers became bishops like Dunstan's. Old abbeys and nunneries were reformed or refounded after the Danish destruction. And here is an Anglo-Saxon monk. The monarchy developed control over the monasteries and thus controlled vast landed wealth, and much of this wealth then passed into the hands of the monarchy. But the monarchy also founded and refounded many abbeys in the Danelaw and granted them land. And so what we end up with in England is a network of monasteries all over England, loyal especially to the crown, to the king. And this strengthened royal power. So monastic reform ended up in strengthening royal power. The royal administrative machinery was developed from the retinue of a king. It consisted of his comitatus, which would be bodyguards, and his personal servants, the income from his demesne, and an itinerant court. And here are English ecclesiastics. And here is the kind of household staff that the king had. Over time, much more was committed to writing, and in the Anglo-Saxon government, many lay officials were literate. There's an abundance of Old English inscriptions on rings, brooches, and church walls. Ealdorman Ethelweard translated the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle into Latin, and a Latin version does survive. The king himself had a household staff, and I'll run through the members of that. The chancellor was the head of the writing office. The constable supervised the royal hunt and led the royal army. The chamberlain kept the king's treasure. He was originally the keeper of the king's bedchamber, and the king hid his treasure under the bed, and so that's why the chamberlain became the treasurer in the king's court. The steward was in charge of the food, and he was an advisor and a travel companion. The butler was in charge of the wine, and he was also an advisor and a travel companion. We mentioned the Witan or the Witangimo earlier. Either it was a small household group as above, or the larger and more formal assembly of magnates, like the old Germanic tribal assemblies, a flexible and informal institution, but not a representative assembly. They had no formal right of veto over royal policy. They were strictly advisory. But a good king knew that he had to consult with the Witan before he did anything. Okay, and here are our Saxon warriors again. And here is a scribe, because they were all literate. The Witan played a crucial role in Anglo-Saxon government, but it was not a proto-democratic national assembly. The king wasn't bound by it. There was a hierarchy of the peasantry and the aristocracy. There were really four classes in England. You had slaves, you had villeins who were bound to the land. They were like serfs. Then you had ceorls, who were free farmers, a peasant elite, and thanes, a warrior aristocracy. And here they correspond to the Viking classes of thralls, and there's no villain class among the Vikings, carls and jarls. Carls being the free farmers and free warriors, and the jarls being the aristocrats. But some were equal to the better off ceorls or churls. Okay, and here are the Anglo-Saxon farmers. Okay, we'll stop here and take our break, and we'll continue after our break of 15 or 20 minutes.